Hi, I'm Logan Isaac, and this is 5 things you'll wish you knew before talking to soldiers and veterans. All right, number 1, don't ask. ASK is an acronym that I use to stand for All Soldiers Kill. This assumption, the stereotype that a lot of civilians hold about soldiers and therefore veterans, that most soldiers will see frontline combat and therefore there's a question mark as to whether or not they've killed in combat. A lot of soldiers in the last 20 years have gone to combat, but the fact remains that the vast majority of the United States military personnel are service and support personnel, not combat arms. And it kind of creates this prestige around killing that's really dangerous. And so asking it is more likely going to bring up feelings of inadequacy in soldiers that haven't killed, and there's much more damage that can do than good. And so number 1 is don't ask. Don't assume all soldiers kill, and don't ask if they have. All right, so that brings me to our second acronym, and that acronym is PTSD. We all know what it stands for. Say it with me. Please try something different. Many of you, I'm sure, said post-traumatic stress disorder. For soldiers and veterans, that, like the ask all soldiers kill stereotype, it can get in the way of real human connection between soldiers and veterans and civilians. And that's because trauma is social. It isn't that soldiers and veterans have in and by themselves, experienced some trauma that they're internally trying to work on. It is a trauma that we experience within our community, which includes civilian society. A lot of soldiers and veterans have started dropping the D from PTSD in the diagnostic sense because it doesn't feel right to suggest that we are the only ones that are disordered. We too easily jump into diagnoses to give structure and justification for this military-civilian divide. When we, as soldiers and veterans, are assumed to be the site of disorder, a lot of us find that frustrating, and it will get in the way of having real connections with soldiers and veterans. So please try something different. All right, so that brings us to number 3. And number 3 is an acronym increasingly to soldiers and veterans, but not to civilians. And that acronym is TYFYS. I'll give you a second to try and guess what that is. If you haven't guessed, that acronym stands for Thank You for Your Service. And thank you for your service is usually really well intended, but the problem with it is the amount of times that it's said over and over and over again. One example I use is a real example. I never met the person, but I was just having kind of a crappy day and I just didn't have any patience. And they said, they learned I was a vet. And I said, thank you for your service. And I said, which part? They didn't know how to respond to that. And they said, well, all of it, like, thank you for your service. And I said, well, there were things that I did that I don't want to be thanked for. And they didn't like that. And then they said, I was just trying to be nice. And that's when I realized that it wasn't about it. The person saying it wasn't doing something for me, they were doing something for themselves. TYFYS should be adapted or changed. And there's all kinds of recommendations for what you might say instead, like welcome home, how was your day, tell me about your service. And I won't get into those here, but only to point out that maybe you shouldn't say it. That TYFYS is military code for I don't want to hear it. All right, so number 4 on this list of 5 things you'll wish you knew before you talk to soldiers and veterans is not an acronym, it's a hashtag. Hashtag GI Justice is civil rights for soldiers and veterans. Civil rights is about employment discrimination protections, it's about hate crimes prevention, it's about equal access to education and opportunity. Employment discrimination falls to this law called VEVRA, the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment and Assistance Act of 1974. That created affirmative action for veterans, but there's a lot of veterans alleging employment discrimination that are getting their rights withheld because they aren't getting equal representation before the law. In fact, the Department of Labor's own enforcement data shows that they receive more VEVRA complaints by veterans than they do any other statute that they have in their jurisdiction. Nonetheless, veterans filing complaints under VEVRA are up to 4 times more likely to be denied their claims, their complaints. And so there's this disproportionate disbelieving veterans when they make employment discrimination complaints. Another one that I'll try and keep brief is hate crimes prevention. In 2009, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act created deterrence for people targeting members of a community. Section 4712 of the HCPA protects service members and their immediate family members throughout their 8-year military service obligation plus 5 years. So 13 years of protection from hate crimes. You may wonder, like, are hate crimes really happening against service members or their family? And the answer is we don't really know, because the Department of Justice provides no means of reporting alleged hate crimes, like spitting or throwing a brick through your window or fill in the blank. But there are some examples. It does happen. Because it's easier to get a conviction through domestic terrorism, there's no deterrence. There's no inbuilt deterrence for a regular person, not a domestic terrorist, who attacks or demeans or somehow assaults or damages the property of a service member, because the DOJ will not enforce it, and it doesn't accept allegations from service members if they think something has happened. If you want to learn more, go to gijustice.com. I have a whole lot of introductory material there, and the stuff about the history of civil rights and the military history of civil rights is in one of the last chapters of my third book, God is a Grunt. But I think it's really important that if you want to talk to soldiers and veterans, you'll wish you knew about civil rights and how they influence human dignity. All right, so that brings me to my fifth and final thing that you'll want to know before talking with soldiers and veterans. And this one's not an acronym and not a hashtag. It's just a reminder that God is with us, that we are not alone, that there is nowhere that we can go that God hasn't already been and is willing and able to follow us to. One of the oldest creeds has this line about God descended into hell to free the captives, to harrow hell. There's even this line in Scripture about the gates of hell will not prevail against us, which assumes that we go to hell to free our brothers and sisters. God is capable and willing to follow us even to hell. That doesn't say that God is on our side or God pulls the trigger, but God does not abandon us to the most horrific circumstances that we have to experience. When the pain and the struggles of this world prove too much, God welcomes us home with open arms. All right, so there you have it. Those are my 5 things you'll wish you knew before talking with soldiers and veterans. I appreciate you joining me for this. I hope you'll order my latest book, God is a Grunt, and more good news for GIs. You can also go to pewpewhq.com to learn how to promote human dignity for soldiers and veterans in your own community and context. Thanks for joining me.